The importance of bracing for stabilising your spine. This is what we're going to be talking about in this part of the beginner's guide. We're going to cover three things. You can see them on the screen. Number one is hollowing versus bracing. Number two is the layers of the core muscle. And number three is this idea of guy wires and how that helps stabilise the spine. First of all, it's hollowing versus bracing. Now, from a very simple perspective and a simple way of explaining it, hollowing is activating your TVA and it doesn't stabilise the spine. Contrary to what many people will say that it does not stabilise the spine, and I'll give you an example in a second. When we talk about bracing, what we're trying to do is the co-activation of the entire core musculature, and that does stabilise the spine. So I can share an example. If you were sat where I'm sat, and I gave you a light weight and just sort of held it in front of your body or held it away from you like so, and then I asked you to stand up from that seated position, but I want you to think about what your tummy muscles are doing, what your rectus abdominis, your obliques, so on and so forth, what they're doing. And what you'll find is that when you're about to lift off the seat and contract your leg muscles, your core muscles will tighten. That's an example of bracing. That's an example of the co-activation of the core muscles. Another example is when you cough or when you sneeze. That's a brace. When you laugh, it's a brace. If someone came up to you and faked to punch you in the stomach, you would tighten the stomach like that. Those are all examples of bracing. Hollowing, when someone says to draw your navel in, or suck your navel in, or anything like that, and what they're trying to do is activate the transverse abdominis, that is not stabilising the spine. Because if we go back to my first example, which was getting up out of the seat, from an unconscious level, that's what your body wants to do. What most people have, unfortunately, isn't what I would possibly describe as an untuned core. So what we have to do is we have to tune the core and train it to not only contract at the right time, but also get the right muscles working at the right time. And another thing that I would always describe this would be, it's like a pre-brace. So what we're doing, instead of just letting it happen unconsciously and not randomly, but not happen potentially when we want it to happen, what we're doing is we would then pre-brace, so we would fix everything in place, and then we would get up, rather than try and sort of jolt our way up and then allow the muscles to try and catch up with that. So what we want to be doing when we're doing any core exercise or any exercise, in fact, is brace the core. And what we have to mention as well is we have to brace appropriately for the task. So if it's a heavy task, it's a heavy brace. If it's a light task, it's a light brace. And anywhere in between, that's how we need to brace. Medium, light, heavy, whatever it needs to be, depending on the activity that we're doing. Layers of the core. So what you can see here, you've got rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis. So you can see rectus abdominis are these muscles here. You've got an abdominal fascia that comes over the top of them anyway. And then they've taken a sort of a cut out of the rectus abdominis, and what you can see down here is the transverse abdominis. So you're starting to see layers, basically, is what we're trying to get at. So there are layers of the core. If we come down to this diagram, what you can see, transverse abdominis is on the inside. Then you've got internal obliques. Then you've got external obliques. Then you've got the superficial fascia. Out we come. You can see here, we've got rectus abdominis, rectus abdominis. Again, you've got the sort of superficial fascia on the outside. So what we're trying to say, which is kind of as we've mentioned with the brace, is we've got all of these layers, and obviously the TVA, internal obliques, external obliques, and fascia, again, we've got those layers all around the outside. Now, these back muscles will be included, but I'm just going to stick to these for now. So when we are bracing, what we are trying to do is brace and hold down all of these, because what these are starting to do, these are starting to act like these guy wires that I talked about and hold the spine in place. So what we're doing, if we use the center of the sort of where the spinal cord goes as the center, What we're trying to do is hold all of these down. And one thing we need to remember here is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the transverse abdominis will give us, let's just say, for example, I don't know if this number's true, let's say it will give us, or it will be able to hold 10 kilos of weight before it buckles. And then the next layer, which is internal obliques, can hold another 10 kilos before it buckles. And then external obliques will hold another 10 kilos before it buckles. And then rectus abdominis, another 10 kilos before it buckles. So what we've got there, and then on the other side, all before it buckles. So let's just say we've got 3 layers here, so that's 30 kilos. And then we've got this one here, which is 40 kilos. So let's just say, as the example, if we just took the parts, it would be 10 kilos per layer. If we use then the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, if we co-contract all of these together, it would add up to 60 as an example. So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you take the sum of its parts and look at them in isolation and they can hold 10, it equals 40, as we've described. But when we co-activate them and bring them all together, it goes all the way up to 60. So we're gaining a benefit by contracting all of them. Now again, as I mentioned, those numbers are false. I don't know what they are. It's just to give you the idea of the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So that's what we need to be focusing on, is that co-contraction. And in some respects, this diagram is helping us understand why. Finally, it's guy wires. Now, I've started drawing this sort of concept or this idea of what the muscles are doing, and it's these guy wires. And again, if we use this diagram here, and we've got the centre of the spine here, which is where the spinal cord will go, so we just call that the centre. And then what we've got is we've got essentially muscles all the way around, which what we want to do is they're anchored to the pelvis. So the pelvis is our platform, and all the muscles are, in some respects, the guy wires that are holding the spine up. So this is a bird's eye view. If I was to then draw, that's the pelvis, that's the spine. We've got more muscles. There are a variety of muscles that will be doing this, not just the ones we've talked about so far, but it will be holding it down, holding it down, holding it down. So let's just say this is a view from the posterior, so a view from the back. So again, what's happening here is these anchors are holding everything in place, and each one of these guy wires, each one of these lines is a muscle, and it's holding. So if we make those slack, the spine is liable to move to the left, move to the right, sway around. But if we lock them all down, then we're going to be holding the spine rigid against the pelvis. If we've only got one doing it, then it's not going to be as strong as having all 3 of these doing it. Also, these muscles out here, so external obliques, which have the biggest lever because they are the furthest away from the spine, they have the most effect of stabilising the spine. If we take the transverse abdominis, which is closer to the spine, then it doesn't have as much of a lever, and it won't be as strong or as good at holding this spine up. So what we are trying to do with the brace is co-contract not only the muscles sort of closer to the spine, but also the ones further away from the spine. So if we're just using TVA, if we go by the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, doing that falls down, because if we try and contract a muscle in isolation, it's not as strong as if we contract them all together. So it's not going to stabilise the spine as well. If we then look at just the very simple sort of biomechanics of it or mechanics of it, and we look at the lever arms of it, again, the ones further away are going to be much better at stabilising than the ones closer, because the lever's longer and it's going to be able to hold it in place much more effectively. So the importance of bracing is it's stabilising the spine, and it's not hollowing, which isn't stabilising the spine. So as I mentioned before, we need to pre-brace, so we need to essentially when we go for the lift or we go for the hold or we do whatever, we need to be locking down the torso and the spine against the pelvis so we can perform the lift or whatever it might be. What we're also doing is making sure that the spine doesn't bend whilst we move. And then what we need to do is just do that appropriately. So again, if it's a heavy task, we do a heavy brace. If it's a light task, we do a light brace, and all the way in between, the same concept holds. So if you find this useful, then start applying it. If you want to start building and improving the brace, I've got my 12-week online course, which again, if you just click down in the link below, you can go through to it. It's a beginner's course, so it takes all of these concepts, all of these ideas that I'm talking about through this beginner's guide, and applying it into an online 12-week program. So you will be bracing, you will be doing training the hips, you will be doing all these other things that I'm talking about during this beginner's guide. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. I look forward to speaking to you in the next tutorial.